30 years ago. 9 skeletons were discovered buried within Stirling Castle. Their identities remain a mystery, but injuries found on them suggest they all suffered brutally violent deaths. Dr. Jo Buckberry, a battle trauma expert, believes they date from 1296 to 1357, during the Scottish Wars of Independence. Today, Jo is going to reveal to us the clues that might help identify who these people were and uncover how they met their ends. And I'll be joining Jo to add some extra historical context to these grim discoveries. So Jo, this is our first one. This is in lots of pieces. Is this a result of being in a grave for so long?
Normally that's the kind of thing we'd think with a medieval skeleton. In this case, they're actually relating to around the time of death. So they sort of suggest to us that this individual met a particularly brutal end.
So we've got a skull that's in innumerable pieces. That could be related to the cause of death.
Absolutely. When I slowly piece this together into its many pieces into an almost whole, we've got 44 separate fractures on the skull alone.
44 just to the skull?
Just to the skull. Now, that's not 44 separate injuries. There are multiple points of impact within that. So probably 8 or 9 thereabouts. It's quite difficult because we don't have all of the pieces. But when I pick them up, they actually fit together extremely well. And in some cases, the lines are really, really straight, which is really characteristic of perimortem trauma, so trauma that happened around the time of death. Occasionally it zigzags a little bit, but it's all moderately regular in terms of the breaks that we see.
So that gives us some kind of clue as to how this person met their end.
Absolutely.
Pretty brutally.
One of the problems we have with perimortem trauma is the timing of that. So if I wanted to say something happened before death, I'd look for evidence of healing. We're not going to see that on bone until 1 to 2 weeks after the injury occurred. And then in terms of the breaks like this tells us that the bone was elastic. It was able to move when the injuries happened. But we have various forensic studies that have told us that could be anything up to 3 months post-death. So it's actually, for me, perimortem's quite a wide interval. I'm working on the basis that these injuries did happen at the time of this person's death and they resulted in their death. But it's a little bit difficult to be 100% certain because we don't have the soft tissue evidence that a pathologist might use to pinpoint that down even further.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a shocking start. 44 fractures to the skull around the time of death. And now I'm looking everywhere else and I'm seeing shattered bits of bone. Is that also connected?
The vast majority of it is. Once you have a break in a bone, it's more vulnerable to break further. So some of the breaks are post-mortem, they happened in the buried environment, but other ones definitely happened, or almost certainly happened, I should say, around the time of death.
In 1304, as part of the First War of Scottish Independence, Scotland's resistance to England's attempts at conquest, Stirling Castle came under siege by King Edward I. A strategic stronghold, the castle changed hands several times and had been a symbol of Scottish defiance since William Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297. By 1304, it was one of the few remaining places of Scottish resistance. Could the location of these skeletons indicate that they were perhaps killed and buried in one of the sieges during the Scottish Wars of Independence?
For me, the rib fractures are particularly interesting. This is a really classic post-mortem rib break. It's straight across the bone. Those edges are paler than what they are normally. It's kind of like completely across. So that's the type of thing that happens with dry bone when it's no longer got fluid
So that's just from resting in the grave.
But then when you look at something like this, it's got these really deep zigzags. Dry bone doesn't break like that. I was fortunate enough to do a course on trauma, and the first bone I looked at had a rib with a fracture very, very much like this, and it was from a modern car crash. Piecing the evidence together, this type of fracture seems to be a lot more consistent with a really high force, high velocity impact. Some of them have a mixture of the zigzag and not. Maybe this was in the ground part way through the decomposition process. It gets increasingly difficult to be 100% certain on a few of them.
If we've got 44 injuries to the skull, do you have any sense of how many injuries this person suffered around the time of the death across the body?
Around 100. And each time I look at them, I find more things that look like they're trauma. Every single rib has at least one fracture. They've got fractures to both of their clavicles, both of their scapulae, so shoulder blades. In this case, the fractures are quite modest, whereas in this case, the bone has completely shattered. We've got a particularly nasty fracture to the top of this humerus, so just beneath the shoulder.
And is it the zigzag that's giving away?
Yeah, the zigzag and also the texture. So the fracture in here, the surface texture in here is kind of regular. It's really hard to see this here because that bone's so thin. But if we look at this other fracture, it's this kind of slightly grainy but slightly smooth texture is really characteristic of something that happened around the time of death. Also, it's a very similar colour to the bone on the outside. So that has been in contact with whatever has stained this bone, this particular sort of yellowy orange colour, for the same amount of time, which is, again, more consistent with perimortem trauma.
This person obviously suffered some humongous trauma at or around the time of death, which presumably killed them. Do we have a date for when this person died?
So we have a radiocarbon date that puts this person firmly in the 13th century, so right in the right period for the Wars of Independence.
It's incredibly evocative to think of this person being involved in a siege at Stirling Castle.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing on this person is we don't have any evidence of injuries from a weapon. It's all these crushing injuries, sort of blunt force injuries is what we've referred them to, so anything with a large surface area. And it's very difficult to say exactly what happened, but this is not a person who died in a battle on a battlefield where we'd expect to see sword injuries and, other things like that. Absolutely none on this particular individual.
Wow. So just with the sheer amount of damage and trauma and being inside Stirling Castle with its position on this frontier between England and Scotland for so long, it's tempting to think about this person being caught up in one of the sieges and maybe hit by a trebuchet ball fired from outside the castle. And you can't help thinking we're looking at someone killed by Warwolf. Ordered specially by Edward I, Warwolf is believed to have been the largest trebuchet ever made. It was so large that it reportedly took 5 master carpenters and 49 other labourers at least 3 months to complete it. Eyewitnesses at the time report it hurling stones through the castle walls like an arrow flying through cloth.
It's quite likely that a trebuchet is what perhaps caused these injuries. We know that there were multiple things being sort of thrown over the castle walls prior to the Warwolf being built. So it could have been one of those earlier siege engines that caused the damage. In that case, you would have something coming over the walls and hitting this person directly, which is that high velocity side of it. And the other possibility is it does relate to the Warwolf. I'm not aware of any deaths due to any of these things. There's nothing written down that I've seen so far. But my understanding with the Warwolf, it did actually demolish part of the wall of the castle. It's whether or not that falling wall could cause this level of injury, or if that is not enough velocity compared to something that's kind of got that projectile element to
there's
it.
one source that says Warwolf was so big and so powerful that it hurled a stone through 2 walls in one go. So that must have been a huge amount of falling masonry and stone everywhere. And potentially we're looking at someone caught underneath.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility for this person.
Wow, so much evidence that you can tell.
just from what's laid out here, but this person clearly met a horrific end. And I'm really interested to understand, for a person like me who doesn't know anything about this, where would you begin trying to work out whether this is a man or a woman, an old person or a young person?
So personally, I would always start with the pelvis. If you think about it, the pelvis is where all the sexual dimorphism is going on in the skeleton. That's the sort of childbirth aspect for females. So when I look at this person, first of all, this angle in here is quite narrow. So that's the greater sciatic notch. And more importantly, when I look at this part, which is the pubic bone, which goes right at the front of the pelvis, the angle underneath is narrow, it isn't concave, it's quite flat, and there's no ridges on this side either. So all of those are really strong male characteristics.
Okay, so this kind of V almost shape in here.
Yeah.
And the lack of a sharp angle on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you
points to
look
them.
at it, that's more like a 30-degree angle. If it was a female, I'd expect something more like 60 degrees between my finger and the side of the bone.
And how does this give you an idea of age as well?
So for age, I'd be looking at the joint surfaces. So we can look at the pubic symphysis, which is this joint in here, and we can look at the auricular surface, which is this joint in here. And what I'm looking at is the lumps and bumps, whether or not it's flat or if it's beveled, in the case of the pubic symphysis, if there's an edge to it or not. And in this case, it's got a few little lumps and bumps up here, but it isn't all the way over. So that tells me it isn't really, really young. But at the same time, it doesn't have a complete edge all the way around the bone, which tells me it isn't really, really old.
So this is a man in his 30s?
Yes, probably. I think my age estimate when I did this properly was 29 to 48. So yeah, bang on, 30s and 40s.
I'm impressed by myself already.
That's a good guess.
And what else points to him being a man on the skeleton? Is there anything other than the pelvis that adds to that?
Absolutely. So as well as looking at the pelvis, we'd look at the skull. His skull is a little bit fragmented. But we're looking at things like the size of the mastoid process, which is this lump here, which is just behind the ear. If we look at his forehead, you should be able to see he's got little ridges above his eyes. So those are our supraorbital ridges. And if I look at his mandible, he's got quite a square chin. Okay. So it's coming off quite square. And it flares at the back in here, so it's quite a strong, muscular jawline.
Jo, I guess I'm looking at his teeth and I'm thinking, they look quite white to me. There's maybe some black dots on this one. Can you tell much about his health when he was alive from the teeth that are still left there?
Yeah, there's a few things going on. So first of all, the black dots that you came in here, the more orangey bits are just because his teeth have worn and they've exposed the dentine, which is the material inside the white enamel. But these black dots probably represent the beginnings of cavities in his teeth, so a disease we'd call caries. This one's probably going to be hurting a little bit. Not too much because they're quite small. As these cavities get bigger, you get more and more pain.
He's going to have like an annoying, dull ache in his tooth that might not be enough to send him to the dentist, but it'll be there.
Absolutely. And then the other thing that I can tell straight off is if you look at the front of his teeth, he's got this like darker coloured material attached to them. And so that's dental calculus, which is mineralised dental plaque. So this is the stuff that you brush off your teeth when it's soft. In this case, they're fully mineralised and they've stayed on there. So that's an indication of the level of dental hygiene you'd have, which is pretty typical for this period. And I've seen significantly more grim looking teeth than this set, I've got to say. And if you look on the inside, it's a little bit darker.
Yeah.
Just in there. And that's because this is right next to where the salivary glands are. So you've got more liquid in there, and we tend to see a higher build-up of calculus in that region.
So there's nothing in his teeth that would suggest he was in particularly bad health?
No, I mean, these are a pretty good set of medieval teeth.
Is there anything about this skeleton that tells us about the person's status?
Well, we know two things, really. The first one is where they were buried. So they were buried in a building that was known nowadays as the Old Governor's Kitchen. And when they were doing some building work in it and they excavated, they found a series of individuals, including this one, and also some debris from window glass and things like that, suggesting it was a chapel.
So he wasn't buried in a kitchen?
He wasn't buried in the kitchen. What's really interesting is that Stirling, we've got the Chapel Royal, which is still standing, but there is also documentary evidence for an earlier royal chapel. And the archaeologist who excavated the site believes that these individuals were buried in that lost royal chapel.
Unusual for people to be buried inside a castle in the medieval period. You would normally be buried in a local parish church or the parish church where you were from. So for them to be buried inside the castle, again, kind of hints at no option to bury them anywhere else.
If this was a normal death in the castle, you would have a funeral at the local parish church. And in this case, they didn't have access to that perhaps, and therefore the chapel within the castle becomes important. So in that sense, do they have to be high status to be in that royal chapel? Well, I think perhaps they were, because he's got a series of small skeletal differences that suggest perhaps a smaller gene pool in the population he came from. And that's the kind of thing that you might see in noble families where people are marrying to kind of consolidate their wealth. And so one of the things that I think you'd find quite interesting is he's got a slight curvature to the spine, nowhere near as severe as what's seen in Richard III, but that slight curvature is something, and in this case it looks like it's something that onset when he was a teenager rather than something he was born with. He's also got 2 differences in his wrist, so there should be a little blip of bone sticking out here which is absent. It looks like there was a separate part, and we've also got 2 separate parts in here of one of his wrist bones, and whereas that could be a fracture that hasn't joined together, there's no suggestion of a fracture on that surface. It looks much more like this was a congenital separation of the 2 parts of his bone. And then finally, on the sacrum.
Oh, wow. And so just for a layman, sacrum, we're talking kind of tailbone?
Yeah, tailbone, yeah.
At the back there.
This is quite common. We see this quite often. But his 5th lumbar vertebra, the one right at the bottom of the spine, has kind of thought it's part of the sacrum. So it's fused on the side, but you can just see the remaining joints between the 2 on here. And almost every individual buried at Stirling Castle had an anomaly like this in the sacrum, which is far, far higher than any other medieval population I've seen.
Wow, I just wanted to step out between skeletons to think about that guy we've just seen. So we've got a middle-aged man's skeleton, probably had a toothache all of his life. But those injuries, over 100 fractures, it's incredible to think what he endured. I think it's tempting to consider him being hit by a trebuchet ball from Edward I's massive war wolf trebuchet, but I probably shouldn't get carried away. I need to get back in and see what Jo's got for me with the second skeleton. So Jo, what can you tell us about skeleton number 2?
Well, I think it's now time for you to tell me what you've learnt so far. Where would you start?
What I've learnt is you start at the pelvis. Let's go straight for the pelvis. So I guess if I go for the pelvis, I'm seeing that same kind of deep V, sort of U shape in there.
Yep. Really narrow. It's actually even more narrow than the previous individual we've looked at.
So I'm saying that tells me it's male.
Yes.
Oh, yes. What does it mean that it's narrower?
It's just the range of variation that we see in individuals. For sex assessment, this is more likely in males, this is more likely in females, this is most commonly found in males.
What can we tell about the age of this person?
And so this person is really quite young. We know they're at least a teenager because their pelvis is fused into a single bone. However, it hasn't finished fusing, so different bits of the body join together at different times. And in this case, we have an extra piece of bone here that will have actually fused onto this crest.
So that's not broken off or anything, that's just never been attached?
It's not been attached, it's a completely separate part. And as this individual, if they'd lived a little bit longer, that would have fused into place, giving us the smooth edge that we normally see, rather than this really rippled, what we call an epiphyseal surface.
Wow.
And then using the method that we tried on the previous individual, we can look at the pubic bone again. And this has got those ridges and furrows really deep all the way down, and absolutely no evidence of any edge to that bone whatsoever. So that's right at the earlier age range for this particular area of the body.
And do you have an estimate for how old this person was when they died?
Yep, so looking across the whole skeleton at areas of fusion like this, I would place this person between about 16 and 20 years old, so really quite young.
Is there anything about this skeleton that gives away the status for this young person?
Well, there's another person from that chapel, which is a strong indicator. And he does also have a variation in the sacrum, which is unusual for his age group. Previously, we had fusion at the top. In this case, we're looking at fusion at the bottom. So he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sacral segments, and then an additional one at the bottom in here. And you can see where it's partly fused on the back. So this is the first segment of the coccyx, and that has fused onto the very base of the sacrum. And this is the kind of thing that happens increasingly often as you get old, but it's not something that you would normally see in somebody who died in their late teens. It's a little bit more challenging to find out more stuff about this because doctors aren't interested, so there's less written about it in modern populations. But this type of variation is more common at Stirling than any other population I've looked at.
And is that hinting again at a smaller gene pool, potentially a higher status person?
That's my interpretation of what's going on.
So combined with the fact that he's buried in that chapel, we're suspecting this is a high status young man.
Certainly a strong possibility.
So is this something that would have caused him pain in life?
Not really. I mean, the chances are that he had absolutely no idea that this was there. It was just one of those incidental findings that we have. But he did have something that may well have done. If we just move up into the spine. So what we've got in this vertebra is underneath this osteophyte, which is a bit of an outgrowth of bone, we've got this big cavity. And next to it, we've got these erosions coming around. And this is likely to be a very early stage of tuberculosis, a chronic infection, and one that only hits the bone in about 5 to 7% of people that catch tuberculosis will you see bony lesions. But this is in a really early stage of development. It's not impacting the next bone to it. But as that progressed, you could end up with total destruction of the body, collapse of the spine, and fusion of the several vertebrae into a single piece.
So we've got a young male who's already got a disease that would have caused him really serious problems if he'd lived a bit longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a very untimely end.
Something has happened to this person. Do we have any idea what caused their death?
We do have a few clues. So first of all, if we look at this rib in here, it's very small, but can you see that tiny little cut mark?
Yeah. It's a tiny little nick just across the rib.
Yeah. So that's looking like something has sort of stabbed into that rib. It's clearly really, really small because there's no injury on the rib that sat above it. There's a possibility that the bit that it was above it was lost at the time of excavation. We don't quite have all of it, but this is really quite a small injury.
Is that left front rib quite low down?
It's left and it's fairly low down, coming in kind of from the side.
So someone's stabbed something very thin and sharp
into the
there,
chest.
And it's left a mark on that rib.
Yeah. Yeah, you could, puncture into lung tissue, which obviously is going to start to cause problems, breathing potentially. That's not the only injury this individual has. And so if you actually look back at the skull, they've actually taken quite a nasty blow to the chin. And so if I hold the mandible together, you can see there's this fracture running up. And then when we look inside, particularly in here, you've got this kind of roughened edge, and that's basically where the bone has been pulled back, sort of peeling almost the surface off. And that's a really classic perimortem injury.
Yeah, and there's a zigzag edge to it again, which suggests...
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's less of a zigzag in this case. It's a little bit uneven. And on this side, it's really, really sharp, which is really characteristic of sort of perimortem trauma. But it doesn't stop there. The force of that blow has come up and caused them to sort of like bang their teeth together. We've actually got a fracture through this molar tooth, basically broken that tooth in half, leaving it in the jaw.
So they've had some sort of blow under the chin.
Yeah, it's fractured right the way through into the upper teeth.
That's horrific.
Really, really nasty injury.
Warfare during this period was brutal. Armed with spears, maces, swords and daggers, death was violent and not always quick.
Do we have a sense then of whether that stab wound or this injury might be what killed this person?
I mean, this is not the kind of thing that would necessarily kill somebody. It's the kind of injury you could potentially survive. There are a few other fractures in the body, as well as the ones we've talked about. And again, they're not necessarily things that would have been fatal. The stab wound depends very, very much on how that impacted on the soft tissue. We've just got the bones left to tell us the story.
But it seems like this young man was caught in a fight.
The other fractures could be accidental, but that stab injury is suggesting that somebody else was involved and that person had a weapon.
Oh, I just wanted to come out and catch my breath from that one. To see someone that age, 16 to 20, that's younger than any of my children still are, and someone who has died such a violent death, a stab wound, and such a blow to the jaw that it's fractured his jaw and broken a tooth above it. And then to think that if he'd lived longer, he would have suffered with that tuberculosis that was already beginning to eat away at the bone in his spine. It really highlights the harsh nature of medieval life at Stirling Castle in the 14th century. Almost dreading what Skeleton 3 might have to show us.
So Matt, this is our third skeleton.
Can I have a go at trying to work out a sex thing? Because I know now, but I'm going to go and look at the pelvis.
Go for it.
Okay, and I'm looking at that groove again, and that definitely doesn't look like the other ones that we've looked at. So they look like a V or a U kind of shape. I'm getting much more of a J almost from that. Does that mean it's different?
Yeah, so that's a moderately wide greater sciatic notch. That's the name of the groove. And that is looking more towards what we'd ordinarily see in a female.
Wow, so we've got a female skeleton here.
Potentially. So the way to take that further, which bone did we look at to kind of...
Pubic bone.
Pubic bone, yep. So if I look at this one in here, first of all, that angle underneath is really wide.
Oh, so where those male ones that we looked at were more like this shallower angle, there's much more of a gap
broader.
there.
It's also a little bit concave in this side here, so it's cuts in. And I kept talking about there isn't a ridge. Well, this is the ridge that we're looking for. So it's called a ventral arc, and it kind of cuts away from the edge of the bone. And this is a really strongly indicator for this individual being female.
And what are you able to tell about the age of this person?
So once again, for the age, I was looking at the auricular surface. I was looking at the pubic symphysis. And in this case, you can see there's a little rim all the way around the outside. It's beginning to sort of sink in a little bit in the middle. So this one tells me this person's a little bit older. She was probably in her 40s or 50s when she died. So a bit older than the other individuals.
Okay, and again, if she's found in that chapel, we might be thinking someone high status. Is there anything on the skeleton that can help us get closer to that?
Well, once again, we've got one of those weird indicators of potential genetic difference. So if we look up here, this one is the first cervical vertebra, so the top vertebra of the neck. And what you should be able to see is this gap at the back. Now in life, that would probably have been filled with cartilage. It wouldn't necessarily have been open. But this is, again, it's an unusual skeletal trait. I've only ever seen two in the many thousands of skeletons that I've looked at over the years. And once again, I'm seeing it in this group of people from Stirling Castle. So it's building up this picture of potentially a smaller gene pool.
Incredible. So amongst those other skeletons, we have a middle-aged woman who appears to be possibly high status too. So do we have any idea what killed this person?
Well, once again, we've got some injuries, and this time they're on the cranium. If we look at the top of the skull, we've got these two rectangular injuries on the top. And initially you look at those, you think, well, what are they? Well, for me, a key indicator that these happened around the time of death is the fact that the bone had the ability to bend and flex.
So it hasn't got that dry bone thing that we saw a little bit earlier with that rib.
So what happens if you put pressure on the skull, it bends a little bit. And the fracture that happens on the inside is actually bigger than it is on the outside. So this is known as internal beveling. An internal beveling is a really good indicator that an injury is peri-mortem rather than post-mortem, because you need that flexibility, that movement in the bone tissue itself to actually get that appearance.
Are we looking at the point of a weapon hitting this woman?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not entirely certain what weapon it was. Everything that I've seen sort of in exhibitions, in museums and in books and so on, they've all got a more square cross-section. So things like wall hammers or top spikes of pole axes, things like that. These are actually rectangular, and never actually been able to match this up to a particular weapon with any confidence. Part of me wonders if the weapons that survive, the ones that we see in museums, are the really good quality ones, and maybe those made by the local blacksmith that aren't quite as perfect, perhaps were more rectangular occasionally than square. So difficult to say exactly what they were, but it's something fairly big.
But that hints as well at a violent death. So we're seeing a woman in her 40s or 50s being involved in similar violence to the men that we've been looking at.
This is clear evidence of a weapon of some kind. She's also got a series of fractures to the side of her skull in here that again are peri-mortem. This small piece in here once sat in there. And again, this is the evidence of that beveling. So that's the internal beveling on the flake that's come out. And we have some beveling in there. And then this piece came a little bit further around, again from this complex of fractures. So we don't know exactly what caused that, but that's 4 separate blows to this woman's head, which is quite unusual.
It doesn't look like an accident that somebody has deliberately levelled several blows at this woman's head in an effort to kill her.
Absolutely, and the angle of these two, because they're right on the top of her head, you'd have to be above her and hitting down. So one possible is you've got somebody who's on horseback or something like that and she's on foot. The other possibility is that you have 2 people who are standing opposite each other. She gets hit on the side of the head, goes down, and then these 2 blows come in after that, just because of the angle. It's highly unlikely this was a face-to-face encounter.
So much for the chivalric knight protecting.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The skeletons found in Stirling Castle not only display the brutality of war, but the unfortunate reality of living during times of turmoil when no one was safe.
So we look at these 3 different skeletons. We have an older man, a very young man, a woman in her 40s or 50s, all buried in this chapel at Stirling Castle. Could they be related, or could they be the result of the same attack on the castle?
At the moment, it's difficult to say that from what we have. Really, to tell if they're related, I need some DNA evidence. So I'm waiting on some ancient DNA analysis.
So we could still be looking at a high-status family caught up in an attack on Stirling Castle and buried within the grounds of the castle because there was no other option at the time of the assault.
That's my working hypothesis as well. I think that's probably the most likely explanation for everything that we're seeing. And all of the individuals excavated at the castle have been radiocarbon dated, and we've got quite a nice tight date range for a group of them. And all of the ones that fall in that tight date range have evidence of peri-mortem trauma.
So it could even be that they were all victims of the same attack on Stirling Castle.
It would potentially. And the biggest problem here is the fact that the documentary evidence is talking very much about sieges, talking about the use of trebuchets, not so much fighting inside the castle walls, but we don't know the ins and outs of that. It's not always written down in that much detail, so it's kind of hard to fill in those pieces.
I mean, you can come up with scenarios. It's so tempting to fall into bear traps, I think, and imagine what happened to these people. But, you know, were they caught outside the castle and ambushed and taken back to the castle? Was there an unrecorded assault on Stirling Castle that did involve this kind of violence? Perhaps even our first skeleton caught up in a trebuchet attack. It's fascinating to think what happened to all of these people and the ways in which they might tie together. It'll be interesting to see what that DNA says.
Yeah, and I'm hopefully going to do some more CT work to try and look at those injuries, particularly on the first individual, in a little bit more detail, to tease out a little bit more information about particularly the ones where I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so his number of injuries could go up.
Potentially, yeah.
Wow.
Could potentially go down, but I suspect they're going to go up.
Yeah, incredible.
Although Edward was eventually victorious, taking control of Stirling Castle in 1304, his success was short-lived. 3 years later, he was dead, and just 4 years after that, the castle was back in Scottish hands.
It's always so humbling and emotive to be in the room with remains of people who were alive centuries ago. It's incredible to think of those people. We don't know precisely when they died or what might have killed them exactly, but all of this points to Stirling's long, bloody history right on the frontier of the war between England and Scotland.